You people are too dirty to be here. First class isn't for people like you, it's for people who matter.
Gate agent yells at black triplets. And not knowing their father owns the airline proves that sometimes the airport employees who scream at children about stolen tickets and welfare programs are about to discover that the quiet 13-year-olds they're humiliating have a father powerful enough to own every plane in the fleet, every gate they work at, every employee badge hanging around their neck. Because what this 48-year-old gate agent named Beverly Marsh didn't know when she decided 3 black teenagers standing politely in line must be trouble was that her racism would escalate into 45-minute tirade that would cost her everything, would trigger response from man who could terminate her with single phone call, would expose pattern of discrimination she'd been committing for years, would transform routine boarding into viral evidence that airline racism in 2025 operates through employees who feel comfortable telling black children they smell, they're ghetto, they don't belong, that their tickets must be fraudulent because people like them don't fly without welfare assistance, and her confidence while delivering this hatred, her certainty that she had authority to deny boarding based on nothing except skin color, showed how deeply systemic racism had become normalized, how comfortable discrimination felt when you'd never faced consequences. You 3 step out of line right now, I said step out, don't make me repeat myself, where did you get these tickets? Your daddy teach you to steal, I can smell trouble from a mile away and you 3 reek of it? What is that smell anyway? Is that you? Did you even shower this morning? You look unkempt, you look rude, you look like exactly the kind of passengers who disrupt important travelers, real passengers, people who actually paid for their tickets instead of whatever welfare program got you. Here, I've been doing this job for 20 years and I know ghetto when I see it. Your attitude is a threat to flight safety. These tickets are fraudulent. You're not boarding this aircraft, Beverly Marsh said to Jalen, Imani, and Kira Carter, who were standing at Gate 47 at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport waiting to board SkyWest Flight 623 to Miami, who were 13-year-old black triplets traveling alone for the first time to their cousin's quinceanera, who'd been so excited. That morning when their father dropped them off, who'd carefully prepared all their documentation exactly as he taught them, who'd done absolutely nothing except stand quietly in boarding line with their tickets ready, who'd committed no offense except being black teenagers in space where Beverly had decided black teenagers didn't belong, and her words hit them like physical assault, hit them with accusations they didn't understand, hit them with hatred that seemed to come from nowhere, hit them with humiliation that made other passengers turn and stare. The accusations stolen tickets and welfare program and you smell landed at Gate 47 with weight of every racist stereotype about black people being criminals, being poor, being undeserving of travel or comfort or basic dignity, and Imani felt tears spring to her eyes immediately, felt the shame of being told in public that she smelled when she'd showered carefully that morning, felt the horror of being accused of theft when she'd done nothing wrong, felt her hands start shaking as Beverly's voice got louder as more passengers turned to watch, as the confrontation became spectacle rather than private interaction, and Kira grabbed her sister's hand trying to provide comfort while fighting her own tears, trying to be strong even though she felt devastated, trying to understand why this adult hated them when they'd never met before. And Jalen stepped slightly in front of his sisters with instinct to protect them even though he was just as scared, just as confused, just as powerless. Against Beverly's authority. This wasn't something their father had warned might happen in distant past. This wasn't discrimination their grandparents had faced during civil rights era that existed only in history books. This was happening right now in 2025 at one of America's busiest airports where anti-discrimination policies supposedly existed, where children traveling alone were supposed to be protected, where gate agents were supposed to facilitate boarding, not prevent it based on racial profiling, but here was Beverly wielding her authority like weapon, using her position to humiliate children who had no power to fight back, operating with confidence that suggested she'd done this before without consequences. And if you think airport racism is something we solved decades ago, if you believe gate agents no longer profile black passengers, if you imagine that having proper documentation protects you from adults who've decided your skin color makes you suspicious, then you need to understand that hatred didn't disappear when segregation ended. It just learned to operate through claims about welfare and stolen tickets and threats to flight safety. It just learned to hide behind professional language while delivering same dehumanizing message. Maybe worse now because it happens while everyone pretends merit matters more than melanin, while people deny that black children still get treated like criminals for existing in airports. Jalen had experienced microaggressions before, had dealt with teachers who seemed surprised by his intelligence, store employees who followed him, adults who made assumptions based on his appearance, but having gate agent publicly scream at him and his sisters, publicly accuse them of theft and welfare fraud, publicly humiliate them while other passengers watched, felt different, felt like racism that was comfortable being loud, felt like hatred that expected validation rather than challenge. And he'd been shocked when Beverly first ordered them out of line, had thought maybe there was legitimate issue with their boarding passes, but as her language became explicitly racist, as she started talking about welfare and ghetto and smell, he realized with sinking recognition that this was about who they were, not what they'd done, was about Beverly's hatred, not their behavior. And while shocking, it also wasn't entirely surprising because their father had prepared them for racism, had told them it would happen, had warned them that being excellent wouldn't always protect them, but knowing racism existed didn't make experiencing it less traumatic, didn't make Beverly's venom less painful, didn't prepare them for standing at gate crying while women with authority destroyed their excitement about their cousin's party. "Ma'am, we have our boarding passes," Jalen said with voice that trembled despite his efforts to sound confident, with tone that tried to be respectful even though Beverly had shown them no respect. "Our father bought these tickets for us. We're going to Miami for our cousin's quinceanera. Everything is legitimate. Please just check your system and you'll see our reservation. We have confirmation emails. We have everything you need. Please just let us board." And he held out his phone showing documentation that should have ended this confrontation, showing proof that should have made Beverly apologize, showing evidence that any reasonable person would accept, but Beverly didn't look at his phone, didn't check her system, didn't verify anything, just continued her tirade with voice that got progressively louder. "If you believe children deserve dignity regardless of their skin color, keep watching, because what happens when these triplets text their father will show you that sometimes racism targets exactly the wrong family, and if you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you had every right to be, drop a comment below and tell us your story, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is, because you need to see what happens when humiliating black children means attacking the airline owner's kids. This story doesn't end the way Beverly expects. So hit that like button if you stand against discrimination and subscribe to this channel because we're exposing airport racism that still thrives today. Other passengers at Gate 47 were watching this confrontation now with expressions ranging from discomfort to curiosity. We're witnessing gate agent scream at 3 teenagers. We're hearing explicit racist language about welfare and ghetto. We're seeing children cry while adult berated them. And some passengers looked genuinely disturbed, looked like they recognized something wrong was happening, but not one person spoke up. Not one adult said leave those kids alone. Not one passenger challenged Beverly's authority or defended the triplets, and their collective silence felt like permission, felt like agreement, felt like validation of Beverly's racism, felt like abandonment that made the triplets understand they were completely alone in this, that no help was coming from witnesses who valued their own comfort over children's dignity. But to understand how 3 polite honor students with legitimate tickets and careful preparation ended up being publicly humiliated at airport gate, how trip that was supposed to be joyful celebration became trauma they'd carry forever, how Beverly Marsh's racism collided with children whose father had power she couldn't imagine. We need to go back 6 hours to morning in Atlanta, where this day started not with hatred but with excitement and sibling bonds and father's pride in his children's independence. Jalen Marcus Carter, Imani Grace Carter, and Kira Joy Carter, 13 years old and 8th graders at Washington Preparatory Academy, were black triplets who'd been inseparable since birth, who shared that particular bond of multiples that went beyond normal sibling closeness, who could finish each other's sentences and sense each other's emotions and operate as unit while maintaining distinct personalities. And Jalen was technically oldest by 3 minutes, was the protective one, responsible one, the one who took charge when situations required leadership, loved debate team and student council, dreamed of becoming lawyer or politician, carried himself with maturity beyond his years. Imani was middle triplet, was the peacemaker, the diplomat, the one who mediated conflicts between her siblings, loved writing and poetry, had won school's creative writing contest 2 years running, wanted to be journalist who told important stories, who gave voice to people who weren't being heard, and she carried notebook everywhere to document observations. Kira was youngest by 6 minutes, was the sensitive one, the artistic one, the one who felt everything deeply, loved music and dance, played violin beautifully, had performed solos at school concerts, dreamed of attending Juilliard someday, and she wore her emotions visibly in ways that made her vulnerable but also authentic. Their father, Vincent Carter, was founder and owner of SkyWest Airlines, was one of the most powerful black men in American aviation, was someone who'd built regional carrier from single-leased aircraft into fleet of 40 planes serving eastern United States, was man whose signature could ground fleets and whose authority extended across industry, but he deliberately kept his ownership quiet from his children, had told them he worked in aviation management, had never revealed full extent of his position or power because he wanted them to grow up humble, to understand that worth came from character not wealth, to earn respect through their actions rather than expect deference because of his name, and he'd raised them to be kind and respectful and dignified regardless of how others treated them, had taught them that how you respond to cruelty reveals more about you than about the person being cruel. That morning Vincent had driven the triplets to Hartsfield-Jackson himself even though he had meetings scheduled, had wanted these extra minutes with them, had talked during drive about responsibility and independence and how proud he was of their maturity, and he'd prepared them thoroughly for solo travel, had reviewed emergency procedures, had made sure they had his number memorized and confirmation emails saved and backup plans ready, and when he'd dropped them at departures he'd hugged all three at once saying I love you, call me when you board, text me when you land, have amazing time at Isabella's Quinceanera, tell your aunt I'll see her next month, and the triplets had walked into terminal feeling confident and grown up and ready for this adventure. The Quinceanera was for their cousin Isabella who was turning 15, was celebration that whole family had been planning for months, was party that triplets had been excited about because they'd been practicing dance routine to perform, because they'd helped pick decorations, because Isabella was more like sister than cousin and they wanted to celebrate this milestone with her. And their aunt had specifically requested they come early to help with setup, had said she needed their energy and their creativity, and the triplets had packed their bags with party clothes and comfortable shoes and gifts they'd picked out carefully. Check-in that morning had gone smoothly with agent who processed their tickets efficiently, TSA security had been routine with officers who were professional, and they'd proceeded to gate 47 with hour before boarding, had found seats in waiting area and done homework while they waited, had texted their father updates, had watched other passengers with curiosity, and everything had felt normal, had felt like the wonderful experience their father had planned, had given no indication that Beverly Marsh was about to transform their trip into nightmare. When boarding was announced, the triplets had gathered their belongings and joined the line, had stood patiently waiting their turn, had their boarding passes ready on their phones, and they'd been chatting quietly about the party, about seeing Isabella, about the dance they'd choreographed, when Beverly had appeared at the gate desk, when she'd looked up from her computer and her eyes had landed on them and something had shifted in her expression, had gone from neutral to hostile in seconds, had shown disgust that made them notice even before she spoke. Beverly Marsh was 48 years old, had worked as gate agent for 20 years, and she carried herself with authority of someone who controlled access to aircraft, who decided who boarded and who didn't, and when she'd looked at the triplets her face had shown automatic suspicion that seemed like learned response rather than reasoned assessment, seemed like she'd looked at 3 black teenagers and decided something must be wrong, and she'd called them out of line with voice that was already sharp, was already hostile, was already communicating that she viewed them as problems requiring handling rather than passengers deserving service, and now she stood at the gate desk looking down at them with expression that made them feel small, made them feel unwelcome, made them feel like they'd done something wrong even though they'd simply been standing in line waiting to board like every other passenger. And Beverly's eyes narrowed as she examined them, as her lip curled with disgust that was visible, with contempt that communicated her judgment had already been made. "You 3, Beverly said with voice that cut through the ambient airport noise, with tone that made nearby passengers turn to look, "Step out of line right now, I need to speak with you, move away from the other passengers," and her command wasn't request but order, wasn't suggestion but demand, wasn't delivered with professional courtesy but with hostility that made the triplets exchange confused glances, made them wonder what they'd done to draw this negative attention, made them feel anxiety. rising as they obeyed her instruction and stepped out of the boarding line while other passengers watched, while witnesses began to gather, while their moment of independence transformed into moment of public scrutiny that felt threatening in ways they couldn't yet articulate. Jalen spoke first because he was oldest, because he'd always been protector, because his instinct when his sisters felt threatened was to step forward, and he said with respectfulness their father had taught them, with politeness that hoped to defuse whatever tension existed, "Ma'am, we're just waiting to board. We have our boarding passes. Is there a problem with our reservation? We can show you our confirmation emails if you need to see them," and his attempt to be helpful, his offer to provide additional documentation, his assumption that this was an administrative issue that could be resolved through cooperation, showed innocence that was about to be shattered, showed trust in authority that Beverly was preparing to violate. "I said step out," Beverly repeated with voice that had gotten sharper, with volume that had increased, with tone that now carried edge of anger rather than just professional distance. "Now, don't make me repeat myself again, move away from the line," and the triplets complied immediately, complied because they'd been taught to respect authority, complied because challenging adults felt dangerous, complied because they didn't understand yet that Beverly's authority was being weaponized against them, that her position was being used to target them, that her power as gate agent was about to become instrument of their humiliation, and they stood where she indicated, stood apart from other passengers, stood in space that felt exposed, that felt like being on display, that felt like being marked as different. Beverly took their boarding passes with rough gesture, took them with hands that communicated she expected to find something wrong, took them and examined them with exaggerated scrutiny that suggested she was looking for forgery, for fraud, for evidence of crime, and she held the passes up to light, turned them over multiple times, compared them to her computer screen, performed inspection that went far beyond normal verification, and her performance, her theatrical examination of legitimate documents, communicated to watching passengers that she suspected these children of wrongdoing, that she had reason to question their right to board, that she was protecting flight from potential threat, and the triplets stood watching her performance, feeling confusion that was starting to shift into fear. "Where did you get these?" Beverly demanded after her prolonged examination. "Where did these boarding passes come from? Who gave them to you? How did you acquire access to this flight?" And her questions weren't neutral inquiry but accusations phrased as questions, weren't seeking information but asserting guilt, weren't professional verification but racist interrogation that assumed the worst, and Imani answered with voice that was soft, that tried to be helpful, that hoped honesty would resolve. "Whatever concern Beverly had, our dad bought them, our father purchased these tickets for us, we're traveling to Miami for our cousin's party, everything is legitimate, we have all our documentation." Beverly snorted hearing Imani's explanation, actually made sound of contempt that communicated disbelief, made noise that suggested she found their story laughable, and she said, "Sure he did, I'm sure Daddy bought you tickets, and I suppose Daddy also taught you manners, I suppose Daddy also prepared you properly for travel," and her sarcasm, her mocking tone, her dismissal of their father's existence or capability, carried racism that was becoming explicit, was revealing assumption that black children couldn't have fathers who bought them plane tickets, couldn't have parents who taught them proper behavior, couldn't come from families that valued education and preparation and dignity. And then Beverly did something that made all three triplets recoil. She leaned closer to them, invaded their personal space, and she sniffed dramatically, made exaggerated show of smelling the air around them. "What is that smell?" Beverly said with voice that carried through the gate area, with volume that ensured maximum audience for her degradation of these children. "Is that you three? Did you even shower this morning? Because I can smell something and it's not pleasant. Passengers expect certain standards on aircraft. We can't have people boarding who haven't maintained basic hygiene," and her accusation that they smelled, her public statement that they were unclean, her suggestion that they lacked basic hygiene, hit the triplets with force of physical blow, hit them with humiliation that made Imani's eyes fill with tears immediately, hit them with shame that wasn't theirs to carry but that Beverly was forcing on them anyway. Kira's face crumbled hearing Beverly's words, crumbled with hurt that was visible, with devastation that came from being told in public that she smelled when she'd showered carefully that morning, when she'd put on clean clothes, when she'd prepared exactly as her father had taught her, and she said with voice that broke, with words that came through tears that were starting, "We don't smell, We showered this morning, we're clean, we prepared properly. Why are you saying that? And her defense of herself and her siblings, her attempt to correct false accusation, her plea for Beverly to stop this cruelty, represented final moment of hoping that adult would be reasonable, would recognize mistake, would apologize and let them board. Don't talk back to me. Beverly's voice rose to volume that made passengers throughout gate area turn and stare, rose to level that transformed this from private interaction into public spectacle, rose with fury that seemed disproportionate to anything the triplets had said or done. I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've been a gate agent longer than you three have been alive. I know trouble when I see it. I can spot problems before they board, and you three are rude, you're unkempt. You're exactly the kind of passengers who disrupt important travelers, who cause problems on flights, who make other passengers uncomfortable, and I absolutely will not allow you to board this aircraft and ruin the experience for people who actually belong here. And her words landed with devastating force, landed with implication that was unmistakable, landed with message that these black children didn't belong on this flight, didn't deserve to travel, didn't have same right to board as other passengers waiting in line. Jalen's heart was pounding now, was racing with combination of fear and confusion and dawning understanding that this wasn't about documentation or procedure but about something else entirely, about who they were rather than what they'd done, and he said with voice that tried to stay calm even though panic was rising, "Important passengers? What do you mean important passengers? We have tickets just like everyone else. Our father paid for these seats. We have every right to be here," and his attempt to assert their legitimacy, his effort to claim equal status with other travelers, his insistence that they belonged, represented moment of recognizing that Beverly's objection wasn't procedural but personal, wasn't about rules but about racism. Beverly gestured toward the boarding line with sweeping motion that took in all the passengers waiting, gestured toward group that was almost entirely white travelers, business people in suits and families with small children and college students, and she said with voice dripping with contempt, "Yes, important passengers, real passengers, people who actually paid for their tickets with money they earned, people who have jobs and contribute to society, not whatever welfare program got you three here, not whatever government assistance or charity or scam allowed you to access flight you clearly can't afford. I know the difference between legitimate travelers and people who are gaming the system, and you three are not legitimate. These tickets are suspicious. Your presence here is questionable, and I'm not letting you on my aircraft until I verify that you're not committing fraud." The accusation welfare program hit the triplets like physical assault, hit them with stereotype about black people that they'd heard before but never directed at them so explicitly, hit them with assumption that they must be poor, must be on government assistance, must be unable to afford travel without charity, and the racism was so blatant now, so undeniable, so explicit that several passengers who were watching looked genuinely uncomfortable, shifted their weight, exchanged glances that suggested they recognized something wrong was happening, but not one person spoke up, not one adult challenged Beverly's characterization, not one passenger said this is inappropriate, and their silence, their collective decision to watch rather than intervene, gave Beverly permission to continue, gave her confidence that her behavior was acceptable, gave her sense that witnesses agreed with her assessment. A few passengers glanced over with expressions that ranged from discomfort to curiosity to something that might have been agreement, glanced with body language that showed they were paying attention but not planning to involve themselves, glanced with faces that communicated they recognized drama was unfolding but had decided it wasn't their problem, wasn't their responsibility, wasn't situation requiring their intervention, and watching these adults witness their humiliation without helping made the triplets feel abandoned in ways that compounded their fear, made them understand they were alone in this, made them recognize that all these grown people with power to challenge Beverly's behavior had chosen comfort over courage, had chosen silence over solidarity, had chosen to protect themselves rather than defend children who desperately needed defending. The triplets stood frozen as Beverly continued her tirade, stood unable to move or respond effectively, stood feeling powerless against adult with authority, and Beverly's accusations kept coming, kept building, kept escalating from questioning their tickets to attacking their character to making explicit her belief that they didn't belong, and she said these tickets are stolen, I'm certain of it. Kids like you don't fly without some kind of fraud involved, you probably took someone's credit card, You probably scammed some system, you probably found these boarding passes and tried to use them, but I'm smarter than that. I've seen every trick, and I'm not falling for whatever con you're running. You're ghetto, you're trouble, you're the kind of passengers we don't want on our flights. The word ghetto hung in the air heavy with racist connotation, hung with implication that went beyond describing neighborhood to characterizing people, hung with contempt that communicated Beverly's complete dehumanization of these children, and Imani, who'd been fighting tears, finally couldn't hold them back anymore, finally started crying silently with shoulders shaking, with face crumpling, with visible distress that should have made any reasonable adult stop and reconsider, should have prompted Beverly to recognize she'd gone too far, should have triggered some human empathy, but Beverly looked at Imani's tears with satisfaction rather than concern, looked at her crying as confirmation that she'd correctly identified them as problems, looked at their distress as validation of her suspicions rather than as evidence of her cruelty. Your attitude is a threat to flight safety, Beverly continued with voice that had settled into rhythm of practiced persecution, with tone that suggested she'd delivered similar speeches before, with confidence that came from never facing consequences for this behavior. You're being disruptive, you're being uncooperative, you're displaying exactly the kind of behavior that makes flights unsafe, that makes other passengers uncomfortable, that creates security risks, and I'm fully within my rights to deny boarding to passengers I deem threatening, and you three are threatening, your very presence here is threatening, and I'm not going to allow you to board. I'm going to call security. If you don't leave this gate area immediately, I'm going to have you arrested for attempted fraud, for trespassing, for whatever charges I can make stick. Kira held her sister's hand as Imani cried, held it with grip that was tight, that communicated she was trembling too, that showed she was barely holding herself together, and she looked at Jalen with eyes that begged him to fix this, to make it stop, to find solution that would end their suffering, but Jalen stood in front of his sisters feeling helpless, feeling like the protection he wanted to provide was impossible, feeling like 13-year-old boy against system that had decided they were guilty, and he tried one more time, tried with voice that shook but that held dignity their father had taught them to maintain. Can we please just call our dad? Can we please let him explain? He can verify everything, he can tell you we're legitimate passengers, please just let us call him. If you're watching this and you've ever stayed silent while children were being publicly humiliated because speaking up felt uncomfortable, subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being the person who intervenes next time. Because what happens during the next 30 minutes while these triplets endure Beverly's hatred will show you what silence costs, will show you that witnessing isn't helping. So hit that subscribe button if you believe children deserve protection from racist adults. Beverly laughed hearing Jalen's request, laughed with sound that was cruel, that was mocking, that communicated she found the idea of their father helping them to be absurd, and she said, your dad? What's your dad going to do? Your dad who supposedly bought these tickets? Your dad who you claim can verify everything? These tickets are fraudulent. I've already determined that. There's nothing your dad can say that will change my assessment. You're not boarding this flight. That's final. That's the end of the discussion, and she turned away from them dismissively, turned to begin processing other passengers, turned with body language that communicated she considered the matter closed, considered them handled, considered her job done, and the triplets stood there watching her pivot toward the boarding line, watching her prepare to allow other passengers to board while denying them access, watching their flight preparing to leave without them, watching their cousins quinceanera slipping away minute by minute while they remained trapped at this gate with women who hated them for reasons they couldn't control. Other passengers began boarding now, began moving past where the triplets stood displaced, began walking onto the jetway while casting glances at the three black teenagers who'd been pulled from line, who'd been accused publicly, who stood crying while everyone else proceeded normally, and some passengers looked at them with pity that didn't translate into action, with sympathy that didn't become solidarity, with discomfort that didn't transform into challenge, and others looked with suspicion, with faces that suggested maybe Beverly was right, maybe these kids were trouble, maybe their removal from the boarding process was justified, and watching passenger after passenger walk past them, watching the line empty, watching their flight fill without them, made the triplets understand with devastating clarity that they were being left behind, that their travel was ending here, that all their preparation and excitement and their father's careful planning had been destroyed by one racist gate agent who had power and they had none. The triplets watched helplessly as the boarding line grew shorter, watched as families with young children walked past them onto the plane, watched as business travelers carrying laptops proceeded through the gate, watched as college students laughing together moved down the jetway, watched as every category of passenger except them was allowed to board, and the contrast between their exclusion and everyone else's easy access felt crushing, felt like visual representation of inequality, felt like being forced to watch other people live the life you were supposed to have, and Imani, who was still crying, said through her tears, "We're going to miss Isabella's party. We're going to miss her quinceanera. She's going to think we didn't care enough to come. She's going to be so disappointed." And hearing her sister voice their shared loss, hearing Imani articulate what they were all thinking, made Kira start crying harder, made her sob with grief that was about more than just missing party, was about loss of innocence, was about learning that being good wasn't protection, was about discovering that racism could steal your joy without warning. Their cousin Isabella was more than cousin, was like sister to all three of them, was girl they'd grown up with, was family member they talked to weekly, was person whose quinceanera had been anticipated for months, and they'd been so excited about surprising her with the dance they'd choreographed, about helping with setup, about being there for this milestone moment. And now they were standing at airport gate watching that possibility evaporate, watching their plans dissolve, watching their cousin's celebration happening without them, and the loss felt immense, felt disproportionate to what most people would consider minor inconvenience. But for 13-year-olds who'd never experienced discrimination this explicit before, who'd never been denied something this important before, who'd never felt this level of powerlessness before, the grief was overwhelming, was teaching them harsh lessons about how world worked, about how racism operated, about how easily joy could be stolen. Jalen stood in front of his sisters trying to be strong for them even though he felt like crying too, even though his own heart was breaking watching their dreams of this trip shatter, even though he felt rage and helplessness churning in his chest, and he kept thinking about their father, kept thinking about Vincent who'd trusted them with this independence, who'd been so proud when he dropped them off, who'd believed the world would treat them fairly if they were prepared and polite and responsible, and Jalen felt like they'd failed somehow, felt like they should have been able to prevent this, felt guilt that was irrational but persistent, felt like older brother who hadn't protected his sisters effectively, and he said softly to Imani and Kira, "It's not your fault, none of this is your fault, that woman is wrong, Dad is going to fix this, somehow Dad is going to make this right." But his reassurance sounded hollow even to himself because what could their father do from across the city? What power did he have to reverse Beverly's decision? What recourse did they have when gate agent had absolute authority over boarding? For 45 excruciating minutes this continued, 45 minutes where Beverly kept them standing at the gate while she processed other passengers, 45 minutes where she occasionally returned to berate them further, 45 minutes where she repeated her accusations about fraud and welfare and their unsuitability for air travel, 45 minutes that felt like hours, that felt like eternity, that felt like time had stopped to force them to experience every second of this humiliation in slow motion. And those 45 minutes transformed the triplets' understanding of everything, transformed their sense of safety in public spaces, transformed their trust in authority figures, transformed their belief that documentation and preparation and politeness would protect them, transformed their innocence into knowledge they shouldn't have needed, knowledge that racism was real and immediate and capable of destroying your plans without warning. Passengers who'd boarded early enough to get settled came back off the plane briefly, came to use bathroom or grab something from terminal shops, came and saw the 3 black teenagers still standing at gate being monitored by Beverly, and some of them must have wondered why these kids were still there, must have noticed they'd been in same position for almost an hour, must have recognized something was wrong, but no one asked, no one checked, no one intervened, and their continued silence. Their sustained unwillingness to get involved, their collective decision that 3 crying teenagers weren't worth the risk of confrontation, showed moral failure that was society-wide, showed how racism persisted partly because witnesses stayed quiet, showed how systems of oppression functioned through active perpetrators and passive enablers working together, and the triplets felt that silence like weight pressing down on them, felt abandoned by every adult in this terminal, felt like they existed in bubble of suffering that everyone could see but no one would penetrate. Beverly returned to them periodically during that 45 minutes, returned to deliver fresh accusations, returned to ensure they understood they weren't boarding, returned with energy that suggested she enjoyed this power, enjoyed their distress, enjoyed having captive audience for her hatred, and she said at one point, "You three are lucky I haven't called security yet, lucky I'm giving you chance to leave voluntarily, because if I call police you'll be arrested, you'll have records, you'll have this follow you forever. Stealing airplane tickets is federal crime, fraud is serious offense, and you're looking at charges that could affect your entire futures, so I suggest you leave now while you still can, while I'm still being merciful." And her threats of arrest, her invocation of federal crimes, her suggestion that their futures were at risk, terrified the triplets who'd never been in trouble, who'd never faced legal consequences, who didn't understand that her accusations were baseless but feared that somehow her authority could make them true. Imani had stopped crying quite as hard, but tears still streamed down her face intermittently, streamed whenever Beverly returned with new accusations, streamed whenever another passenger walked past them onto the plane, streamed with grief and fear and confusion that 13-year-old couldn't fully process, and she kept touching the small carry-on bag at her feet, kept thinking about the dress she'd packed for the quinceanera, about the gift they'd bought for Isabella, about the dance shoes she'd brought, about all the preparation that was now meaningless because they weren't going to make it to Miami, weren't going to see their cousin, weren't going to celebrate this important moment, and the loss felt physical, felt like something had been taken from her body, felt like grief that was disproportionate to missing party, but that made sense when you understood it wasn't just about the party, was about learning that world could be cruel for no reason, that adults could hurt you without consequences, that being good didn't protect you. Kira held Imani's hand throughout the ordeal, held it with grip that never loosened, held it like physical connection to her sister was only thing keeping her grounded, and she whispered at one point, "Why does she hate us? What did we do wrong? Why is she being so mean?" And her questions were heartbreaking in their incomprehension, were child trying to understand adult cruelty through lens of fairness and logic that didn't apply, were attempt to find reason in unreasonable situation, and Jalen, who overheard, said softly, "It's not about what we did, it's about who we are, it's about racism," and even as he said it he felt inadequate, felt like his explanation couldn't capture the full horror of what they were experiencing, couldn't make sense of senseless hatred. Jalen's phone was in his pocket where it had been throughout this ordeal, was device that could connect him to his father, could summon help, could potentially end this nightmare, but Beverly's dismissive response to his request to call his dad had made him hesitate, had made him question whether reaching out would help or just invite more mockery, had made him feel like maybe his father couldn't fix this. Maybe this was a situation where even adults who loved them couldn't protect them, and that recognition of limits to parental power, that understanding that his father wasn't omnipotent, that there were situations where even Vincent Carter's love and concern might not be sufficient, felt like another kind of loss, felt like losing faith in safety net he'd always assumed existed. Other passengers continued boarding until the line was completely empty, until every person who was supposed to be on this flight had walked past the triplets, until the gate area was mostly clear except for Beverly and the 3 children she'd denied, and watching that final passenger disappear down the jetway, watching the door to the plane still open but knowing they wouldn't be walking through it, watching their last chance to make the flight slip away, made hope drain from the triplets. Faces made them understand with finality that they weren't boarding, that Beverly had won, that their cousin's quinceanera was happening without them, and the defeat showed in their postures, showed in the way Jalen's shoulders slumped, showed in the way Imani's crying became quiet resignation, showed in the way Kira stopped looking toward the jetway and instead stared at the floor. Beverly seemed satisfied seeing their hope drain, seemed pleased that she'd broken their spirit, seemed to take pride in having denied these black children access to flight they'd been excited about, and she said, "Now that everyone else has boarded, now that the real passengers are settled, I want you 3 to leave this gate area. I want you to go back to ticketing and try to rebook, though I'll be noting in the system that you were denied boarding due to fraudulent documentation, so I doubt any other agent will help you, but that's not my problem anymore. I've done my job, I've protected this flight, I've kept passengers safe, now leave before I call security to escort you out," and her dismissal of them, her characterization of their removal as job well done, her suggestion that they leave voluntarily or face arrest, represented final insult, final exercise of power she'd wielded throughout this encounter, and watching her turn away with satisfaction visible on her face, watching her begin to close up the gate for departure, watching their last thread of hope being cut, made Jalen realize he had to do something, had to try one more time, had to reach out to the one person who might be able to help even though Beverly had mocked the idea. Jalen pulled out his phone with hands that trembled visibly, pulled it out with fingers that could barely grip it properly because adrenaline and fear and grief had made his whole body shake, pulled it out while his sisters watched with expressions that mixed hope and despair, that showed they wanted to believe reaching their father would help but had been beaten down enough to doubt that anything would help. And he opened his messages and stared at the screen for a moment trying to compose words that could capture what they'd experienced, trying to explain in text message what had been 45 minutes of trauma, trying to convey urgency and hurt and desperate need for rescue, and finally he just started typing with thumbs that made mistakes he had to correct, typing through tears that were finally falling from his own eyes, typing message that came straight from his breaking heart. "Dad," Jalen typed, and even that single word felt heavy, felt loaded with expectation that his father could fix this. "Gate agent won't let us board. She says we smell, says we're rude, says we stole our tickets. She's been yelling at us for almost an hour. She called us ghetto, said we're on welfare, said we don't belong here. Imani is crying. Kira is crying. Everyone just watched. No one helped us. We showed her our tickets, but she won't look at them. She says they're fake, says you didn't buy them, says we're committing fraud. The plane is about to leave. We're going to Miss Isabella's party. We don't know what to do. Please help us, Dad. Please, we need you." And he pressed send before he could second-guess the message. Pressed send and then stared at his phone waiting for response, waiting for indication that his father had seen it, waiting for help that might not come in time. 2 minutes passed that felt like hours. 2 minutes where Jalen stared at his phone screen willing it to light up with response. 2 minutes where his sisters watched him with faces that showed they were placing all their remaining hope in this message. 2 minutes where Beverly continued her closing procedures ignoring them. 2 minutes where the plane's door remained open but departure was imminent. 2 minutes that represented gap between their powerlessness and their father's potential. Intervention, and then finally the phone buzzed, vibrated in Jalen's hand with incoming message, and he looked down and saw his father's response, saw words that made his chest loosen slightly, saw instruction that gave them something to hold on to. "Stay exactly where you are," Vincent's message said, and the command was simple but carried weight of authority, carried promise of action, carried reassurance that help was coming. "Don't respond to her. Don't cry. Stand tall. You did nothing wrong. Daddy's coming. I'm leaving right now. I'll be there in minutes. Just hold on. Be strong for your sisters. I love you." And reading those words, seeing his father's promise to come, seeing confirmation that they weren't alone in this, made tears fall harder from Jalen's eyes even as relief flooded through him, made him feel both more emotional and more hopeful simultaneously. Jalen whispered to his sisters with voice that broke but that carried hope, "Dad's coming. He saw my message. He's on his way. He said to stay here and stand tall. He's going to fix this." And Imani looked up at him with face that was puffy from crying, with eyes that were red and exhausted. And she said, "But he's across the city. How can he get here before the plane leaves?" And her practical concern, her recognition of geographical impossibility, her doubt that even their father could arrive in time, was understandable given how thoroughly Beverly had crushed their optimism. But Kira grabbed both her siblings' hands and said, "Dad said he's coming, so he's coming, we just have to wait." And her faith in their father, her willingness to believe despite everything, represented choice to hope even when hope seemed irrational. The triplets stood together now in different configuration than before, stood with renewed determination even though they were still crying, stood with back straighter even though they were exhausted, stood with hands linked even though they were terrified, and they waited while Beverly finished her closing procedures, waited while the plane prepared for departure, waited while minutes ticked by carrying them closer to missing their flight, waited with belief that their father would somehow arrive, would somehow intervene, would somehow use authority they didn't fully understand to make this right, and their waiting was act of faith, was trust in parent who'd never let them down, was hope that persisted despite 45 minutes of evidence that adults couldn't be trusted, that systems didn't protect them, that documentation didn't matter. Beverly noticed them still standing there, noticed they hadn't left as she'd instructed, and she walked back over with irritation visible on her face, with body language that communicated her patience was exhausted, And she said, I told you to leave. What are you still doing here? The flight is closed. You're not boarding. There's nothing left to discuss. If you don't leave immediately, I'm calling security. I'm having you removed. I'm pressing charges for trespassing. Now move. Get out of this gate area. And her escalating threats, her growing anger at their continued presence, her determination to remove them completely, showed she viewed them as problem that needed total elimination rather than passengers who deserved consideration. We're waiting for our father, Jalen said with voice that tried to be firm, with tone that attempted dignity even though he felt small. Our dad is coming, he'll be here soon, he can verify everything, please just wait a few more minutes. And his request for patience, his appeal for Beverly to delay just slightly, his hope that his father's imminent arrival would resolve everything, represented last attempt at peaceful resolution before whatever happened next. But Beverly laughed at his words. Laughed with same cruelty she'd shown throughout this encounter. Laughed with sound that communicated she found the concept of their father coming to rescue them to be absurd, to be fantasy, to be delusion that these children were clinging to because they couldn't accept their defeat. Your father isn't coming, Beverly said with contempt dripping from every word, with mockery that was designed to crush whatever hope they had left. And even if he shows up, what's he going to do? Yell at me? Threaten me? Make a scene? I have authority here. I make the decisions about who boards and who doesn't. Some parent showing up won't change my assessment that your tickets are fraudulent. Won't make me suddenly believe you belong on this flight. Won't convince me that you're anything other than what you are. So stop wasting my time. Stop standing here like you have any power. Leave now or I'm calling security and you'll leave in handcuffs. And her threats, her dismissal of their father's potential intervention, her confidence that her authority was absolute, showed she genuinely believed nothing could touch her, that no consequences would come, that she could torment these children indefinitely without accountability. But even as Beverly was delivering this final ultimatum, even as she was threatening the triplets with arrest, even as she was asserting her untouchable authority, something was happening at the terminal's executive entrance, something she couldn't see from her position at the gate, something that was about to transform this entire situation. Because 12 minutes after Jalen had sent that desperate text message, 12 minutes that had felt like eternity to the waiting children, 12 minutes that represented fastest possible response time given traffic and distance. A black SUV with tinted windows screeched to halt at entrance reserved for airline executives and VIP passengers, screeched with urgency that made airport security look up, screeched with authority that made people move aside. Vincent Carter stepped out of that SUV like man on mission, stepped out in tailored charcoal suit that spoke of power and success, stepped out with two assistants flanking him carrying tablets and phones, stepped out with expression on his face that was controlled but that carried fury underneath, carried rage that was all the more terrifying for being contained, carried determination to reach his children and end their suffering, and airport security who were stationed at that entrance recognized him immediately, recognized the man who owned significant portion of flights operating from this terminal, recognized authority that superseded their own, and they parted like water, moved aside without question, allowed him passage that would have been denied to ordinary parent. Vincent walked through the terminal with purpose that was visible in every step, walked past check-in counters where agents looked up and recognized him, walked past TSA checkpoint where officers waved him through without screening because his face was clearance enough, walked with speed that was just short of running, walked while his assistants struggled to keep pace, walked toward gate 47 where his children were being tormented, where Beverly Marsh was about to discover that the quiet teenagers she'd been abusing for 45 minutes had father whose power could destroy her completely, and other travelers in terminal moved aside seeing him approach, moved aside sensing urgency, moved aside recognizing authority even if they didn't know who he was. Beverly was still berating the triplets when commotion at far end of terminal caught her attention, was still threatening them with security and arrest when she noticed heads turning, noticed people stepping aside, noticed disturbance in normal flow of terminal traffic, and she turned to see what was causing disruption, turned with irritation at being interrupted, turned expecting to see maybe another late passenger or some minor emergency, turned and saw a tall black man in expensive suit, walking toward her gate with entourage, with security parting for him, with authority that was unmistakable, and something about him made her pause, made her facial expression shift from confident aggression to uncertain confusion, made her wonder who this man was and why he was approaching with such purpose. The triplets saw him before Beverly fully registered who he was, saw their father striding toward them with face that mixed fury and love, saw Vincent Carter coming to their rescue exactly as he'd promised, saw the parent who'd never failed them arriving to make this right, and relief flooded through them so powerfully it made their knees weak, made Imani start crying harder but with different quality to tears, made Kira squeeze Jalen's hands so tight it hurt, made all three of them understand that their ordeal was ending, that help had arrived, that they were no longer alone against Beverly's hatred, and watching their father approach felt like watching salvation materialize, felt like being rescued from drowning, felt like first breath after being underwater too long. Vincent walked directly to his children without acknowledging Beverly, walked past her like she didn't exist, walked with singular focus on the three teenagers who'd been standing at this gate for 45 minutes enduring abuse, and he knelt before them despite his expensive suit, knelt on terminal floor without caring about appearances, knelt so he could look directly into their tear-streaked faces, and he examined them with eyes that took in every detail, that saw Imani's puffy eyes from prolonged crying, that saw Kira's trembling hands, that saw Jalen's attempt to be strong despite obvious distress, and what he saw in their faces, what evidence of suffering he observed, made his jaw tighten with barely controlled rage. "I'm here," Vincent said with voice that was gentle with them but carried steel underneath, that communicated safety to his children and warning to anyone watching. "It's over, Daddy's here now, nobody is going to hurt you anymore, nobody is going to treat you like this, I promise you it's over," and he hugged all three at once, pulled them into embrace that tried to shield them from everything they'd experienced, tried to protect them retroactively from trauma that had already occurred, tried to communicate through physical contact that they were safe, that they were loved, that they were his priority above everything else, and the triplets melted into their father's arms, melted with relief and residual fear and grief, melted with sobs that came from 45 minutes of held tension finally releasing. Then Vincent stood to full height that was imposing, stood with posture that communicated authority, stood and turned to face Beverly who was watching this reunion with dawning uncertainty, with first hint of fear creeping into her expression, with recognition that maybe this wasn't ordinary parent, maybe the situation wasn't what she'd assumed, maybe her confidence had been misplaced. And Vincent looked at her with eyes that were cold, that assessed her with judgment, that communicated she was about to face consequences she'd never imagined, and he spoke with voice that was calm but that carried weight of absolute authority, with tone that made everyone within hearing distance stop what they were doing and listen, with control that was more terrifying than shouting would have been. "My name is Vincent Carter," he said with each word precisely delivered, with clarity that ensured there would be no misunderstanding. "I own this airline, I own every plane in this fleet, I own every gate you work at, I own the computer system you use, I own the uniform you're wearing, I own the employee badge hanging around your neck, I own SkyWest Airlines and everything associated with it including your employment," and watching Beverly's face drain of color as understanding hit her, watching her expression transform from confusion to recognition to horror, watching her understand exactly who she'd been tormenting for the past 45 minutes, was moment of reckoning that Vincent had driven across the city to deliver personally. "Sir, Beverly started with voice that had lost all its earlier confidence, with tone that shook, with words that died as soon as they left her mouth because what could she say, what excuse could possibly justify what she'd done? These children were, I thought, there seemed to be, and her attempts at explanation collapsed under weight of recognition that she'd abused the owner's children, that she'd called them ghetto and welfare recipients, that she'd denied them boarding while mocking their father's existence, and her stammering represented first moment since this ordeal began when she had no power, when she was vulnerable, when consequences were imminent. "These children are mine," Vincent said, stepping closer to Beverly, stepping with movement that made her step back. "These are my children, my son and my daughters, the triplets I dropped at this terminal 3 hours ago with legitimate tickets I purchased, with proper documentation I ensured they carried, with preparation I spent weeks teaching them, and you denied them boarding, you called them rude, you said they smelled, you accused them of theft, you told them they were on welfare, you called them ghetto, you humiliated them in front of dozens of passengers for 45 minutes while they cried and begged you to just verify their tickets, and his recitation of her actions, his itemized list of her cruelty, his calm delivery of devastating facts, made Beverly's face go from pale to gray, made her understand the magnitude of her mistake. He paused and then asked with voice that demanded answer, "Did I miss anything? Is there anything else you'd like to add to that list? Any other ways you abused my children while I wasn't here to protect them?" And Beverly couldn't speak, couldn't defend herself, couldn't do anything except stand there while her career and her future crumbled around her, while witnesses watched her being held accountable, while the power she'd wielded so confidently evaporated completely. "There must be a misunderstanding," Beverly finally managed to say with voice that was desperate, with tone that begged for escape from consequences. "I didn't know. I couldn't have known who they were. I was just doing my job. I was following protocol." There were concerns about their documentation, and her attempt to frame her racism as procedure, her effort to characterize abuse as job performance. Her suggestion that not knowing who they were made her behavior acceptable showed she still didn't understand that torturing any children was wrong, that targeting them for being black was crime regardless of whose children they were, that her defense actually made things worse by revealing she'd thought abusing powerless black children was acceptable as long as they couldn't fight back. "There's no misunderstanding," Vincent said, cutting off her excuses. "There's no protocol that justifies what you did. There's no procedure that involves calling children ghetto or accusing them of welfare fraud or denying them boarding based on racial profiling. And the fact that you didn't know who they were, the fact that you thought they were powerless, makes this worse not better. Makes it clear you abuse black passengers routinely when you think no consequences will come." And he turned to one of his assistants and said, "Pull her employee file, every complaint, every incident, everything that's been reported about her, everything that's been swept under the rug. I want complete history. I want to see exactly how long this has been happening." The assistant immediately made calls while pulling up information on tablet, made calls to HR department that suddenly found themselves answering directly to owner, made calls that communicated urgency, made calls that would uncover buried complaints, and within minutes terminal supervisor arrived at the gate, arrived pale and shaking, arrived understanding he'd been summoned by Vincent Carter personally, arrived knowing his own job might be at risk, and Vincent looked at him with expression that demanded answers, demanded accountability, demanded explanation for how Beverly had been allowed to operate this way. The supervisor's tablet showed Beverly's employee file, showed 12 prior complaints of racial profiling that had been filed over 8 years, showed pattern of behavior targeting black passengers, showed incidents that had been reported by travelers who'd experienced her racism, showed documentation that should have resulted in termination years ago but that had been buried, had been dismissed, had been swept aside with excuses about training and warnings and second chances, and seeing that file, seeing proof that Beverly had tormented 12 other families before his children, seeing evidence that system had protected her rather than her victims, made Vincent's controlled fury intensify. 12 complaints, Vincent said with voice like ice, with tone that made supervisor flinch. 12 families you traumatized, 12 incidents of racial discrimination, 12 times passengers reported your behavior and nothing happened, 12 opportunities to stop you before you got to my children, and no one held you accountable, no one terminated you, no one did anything except let you continue abusing black passengers year after year. And he looked at supervisor with contempt that was withering and said, "You're suspended effective immediately pending investigation into how these complaints were handled, into who buried them, into who decided protecting racist employee was more important than protecting passengers, anyone who enabled her, anyone who dismissed complaints, anyone who gave her second chances she didn't deserve, answers to me personally." Beverly started crying now, started with tears that were different from the triplets' earlier tears, tears that were self-pity rather than pain, tears that were about consequences rather than trauma, tears that were about her loss rather than their suffering. And she said, "Please, I have a family, I have children of my own, I need this job, I can't afford to lose my career, please give me another chance. I'll do better, I'll take training, I'll change." And her plea for mercy, her invocation of her own family, her request for chance she'd never extended to her victims, rang hollow. "So did every black family you humiliated," Vincent said without blinking. "So do my children who will carry trauma from this for years. So do the other passengers you abused who filed complaints that were ignored. Having a family doesn't exempt you from consequences. Needing your job doesn't give you right to torment children. You had chances. You had 12 complaints worth of chances. You had years to change and you didn't. And he turned to security officers who'd arrived and said, escort her out, strip her badge, she's terminated effective immediately. She is banned from every airport where SkyWest planes land. She is never to work in aviation again. I will personally ensure every airline in this country knows what she did. And security officers moved forward immediately, moved to flank Beverly, whose crying had intensified, whose face showed recognition that her life as she knew it was ending, whose body language communicated she wanted to resist but understood resistance was futile. And they took her badge, unclipped it from her uniform, removed the symbol of authority she'd wielded so cruelly, and Beverly was led away from gate 47 sobbing, was walked through terminal past passengers who'd witnessed at least part of the confrontation, was escorted out while other travelers watched, while some recorded on phones, while her humiliation became public in ways that mirrored what she'd done to the triplets. Vincent turned back to his children with expression that softened completely, with face that transformed from fury to love, with eyes that showed only tenderness for them, and he said, "Come on, babies, we're not taking that flight, we're going to take the private jet. You'll make it to Isabella's quinceanera with time to spare. You'll get there rested and comfortable. And most importantly, you'll get there knowing that nobody treats my children like that without facing consequences." And the triplets looked at him with faces that mixed relief and residual trauma, with expressions that showed they understood the immediate crisis was over but that processing what had happened would take much longer. On the private jet that departed 40 minutes later, the triplets sat together in leather seats that were far more comfortable than commercial first class would have been, sat in space that was theirs alone, sat surrounded by luxury that their father's success had provided, but none of that material comfort could immediately erase 45 minutes of racial abuse, couldn't undo tears they'd cried, couldn't restore innocence they'd lost, and they were quiet during first part of flight, were processing in silence, were holding hands across armrests while their father watched them with heart that ached for suffering he hadn't been able to prevent, with grief for lesson they'd learned too young, with fury at Beverly that hadn't fully subsided. Imani leaned against her father after a while and said with voice that was small, that was vulnerable, that was still processing trauma, "Daddy, why didn't you ever tell us you own the airline? Why didn't you tell us you had that kind of power? If we'd known, maybe that woman wouldn't have treated us that way, maybe we could have stopped it sooner." And her question represented natural response to powerlessness, represented wish that they'd had weapon to defend themselves, represented desire to have avoided suffering through disclosure of their father's identity. Vincent wrapped his arm around Imani and pulled her close, pulled Kira and Jalen close too, so all three were nestled against him, and he said with voice thick with emotion, with love that was absolute, "Because I wanted you to be kind to people whether they could do something for you or not. I wanted you to develop character that came from who you are, not from who I am. I wanted you to earn respect through your actions and your dignity, not to demand deference because your father owns things. Wanted you to grow up humble and grounded and understanding that your worth comes from inside you." And he paused before continuing, "But when someone disrespects my children, when someone abuses you, when someone targets you for your skin color and torments you while you're powerless, they learn exactly who I am. They learn that protecting you is more important than any principle about humility. They learn that nobody messes with my babies without facing everything I can bring against them." At the quinceanera that evening in Miami, the triplets danced with their cousin Isabella, danced with joy that was real but tinged with shadows of the morning's trauma, danced with smiles that were genuine but that occasionally faltered when they remembered Beverly's face, danced with celebration that was deserved but that felt different than it would have felt if the day had gone as planned. And Isabella, who'd been told what happened, hugged them tight and said, "I'm so sorry that happened to you. I'm so glad you made it anyway. This party wouldn't be the same without you." And her love and acceptance helped them feel valued, helped them remember they were more than Beverly's victims, helped them reclaim some of the joy that had been stolen. Vincent watched his children dance from edge of the floor, watched with pride that mixed with ongoing fury, watched with love that was fierce, watched with recognition that they'd handled themselves with dignity throughout ordeal that would have broken many adults, and their grandmother approached him, squeezed his arm, and said, "You raised them right, Vincent. They stayed calm when that woman was cruel. They were polite even when she was hateful. They showed character that you and their mother instilled." And Vincent nodded, saying, "That's all I ever wanted for them, wanted them to have strength and dignity and kindness regardless of how they're treated, but watching them suffer today, knowing I wasn't there to protect them for 45 minutes, knowing they experienced that level of racism, breaks my heart in ways I can't fully express. If you're watching this and you realize you've been the passenger who watched children suffer without intervening, subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being the person who speaks up next time, because those witnesses at Gate 47 will carry guilt forever knowing they stood silent while Beverly tortured 3 kids. So hit that subscribe button if you believe protecting children matters more than your comfort. 1 month after the incident, Vincent announced comprehensive overhaul of SkyWest's employee conduct policies, announced mandatory bias training for all staff, announced zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, announced new reporting system that ensured no complaint would ever be buried again, announced independent oversight to review all discrimination claims, and he named it the Carter Protocol after his children, made their suffering catalyst for systemic change, made their trauma mean something beyond their personal experience, made sure other Black passengers would be protected by reforms born from what his children endured, and the announcement made national news, made other airlines examine their own policies, made Beverly's firing and the circumstances behind it public knowledge. Beverly meanwhile faced lawsuits from 3 of her previous victims who came forward after seeing news coverage, faced legal action from families she'd abused years earlier who'd filed complaints that were ignored, faced financial consequences that compounded her job loss, and she lost her home within 6 months, lost ability to pay mortgage without income, lost stability she'd taken for granted, and her husband who'd initially supported her left after learning full extent of what she'd done. Left after seeing videos passengers had posted online, left taking their children who told friends they were ashamed of their mother, and Beverly spent following years alone, alone because friends distanced themselves, alone because family was embarrassed, alone because she'd become unemployable pariah, alone replaying moments she'd looked into Vincent Carter's eyes and realized she'd destroyed her own life one racist word at a time. At Christmas dinner months later, Jalen raised his glass with family gathered around, raised it with voice that was stronger than it had been at the airport but that still carried marks of what he'd experienced, and he said to Dad, "For teaching us that we belong everywhere, for teaching us to maintain dignity even when others try to strip it away, for showing us what happens when people forget that every Black child deserves protection," and the family cheered with recognition of Vincent's love, cheered with pride in the triplets' resilience, and Vincent pulled his children close saying, "Nobody messes with my babies, nobody hurts you without answering to me," but in his heart he knew that justice for his children didn't equal justice for all Black children, knew that his power had protected them but countless other Black kids faced Beverly Marsh types without powerful parents to intervene, knew that systemic change was necessary but insufficient, knew that his triplets would carry scars from this. The resolution wasn't perfect because Imani developed anxiety about airports that required therapy, because Kira had nightmares about being called ghetto, because Jalen felt guilt about not protecting his sisters better even though he'd done everything possible, because Beverly's termination didn't undo 45 minutes of trauma, because the Carter Protocol helped future passengers but didn't heal past ones, because justice came but healing was slower, because the triplets learned that being excellent Black children with powerful fathers still didn't fully protect them from racism, still didn't prevent them from being targeted, still didn't spare them from discovering that their skin color made them vulnerable in ways their preparation couldn't prevent, and they carried that knowledge forward, carried it alongside their resilience, carried it as burden that shouldn't have been theirs but that was theirs anyway, carried it while trying to maintain hope their father had taught them, carried it while knowing the world was both better than Beverly and worse than they'd believed before that morning at Gate 47.